Ha, ha.
Shields and swords, fill the wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Why are you in this class? It's a question I often ask my students, and the answer they give is technically true, but not really what I'm asking. Very often they say, I'm in this class because it's a requirement for my degree. But that just leads to a further question. Why is it a requirement for your degree? Why? In every accredited school you could go to, in the best schools in the world, in the okay schools in the world, and even in poor schools, is there always a literature requirement? What is it about it that makes it important? And I think anything that you do, you should ask yourself, what is the purpose of this thing? Not just to check a box and say, I did this thing, but rather, why are you doing this thing? Why is it that in order to be an educated person in any field, you have to at least have a basic understanding of literature and how it works? Well, sometimes people talk about literacy, but the truth is that you don't really need the level of literacy that you're getting. We also hear people talk about critical thinking. And I do think that critical thinking is an important thing which can be taught through literature and should be taught through literature, but is not really its ultimate purpose. I think literature has a different ultimate purpose. You see, I think literature is a way of delivering hard wisdom from the past. What do I mean by that? When you get together with someone that you don't know very well, you will engage in small talk, and you'll talk about the weather. You'll talk about sports. You'll talk about things which are not that important. But when you imagine things that are impolite to talk about, sometimes things like politics, money, sex, religion, why these things? Why are those things you're not supposed to talk about? Well, you're not supposed to talk about them because they matter. They're the most important things that there are. They're the real basic things of human existence. Well, when you think about literature, from a purely utilitarian standpoint, it doesn't seem like we need stories. It doesn't seem like we need poetry. It doesn't seem like we need literature at all. Yet every human society that has ever existed has had literature, has had poetry, has had stories and folklore and mythology. So it must serve a basic human function. And I think that that function is to take hard wisdom from the past and put it forward. What do I mean by hard wisdom? Well, in this case, I'm talking about wisdom that is difficult for someone to understand. Often it's difficult to understand because they're not in a place in their life when they can understand that. Or sometimes it's difficult because it's simply hard to hear. So let me give you a good example. A common, folklore, a common fairy tale is the story of Little Red Riding Hood. And there are various versions of this throughout the world. And the basic, Western European version is there's a little girl. She's on her way to her grandmother's house in the woods. Her mother tells her not to stray from a certain path, but she strays from that path. A talking wolf, confronts her, asks her where she's going, and she says she's going to her grandmother's house. The wolf then, goes quickly to grandmother's house, usually eats the grandmother or stuffs her in a cupboard or something, and then pretends to be the grandmother, gets into bed, And then when Little Red Riding Hood comes, the wolf tries to lure her into bed to eat her. And depending on the version of this, she's either eaten, or she manages to escape through her own ingenuity, or she cries for help and there's a nearby woodsman or some other tradesman who comes and saves her, and sometimes can save the grandmother too. Why do we have this story? Well, the hard wisdom of this story is this. If you're a little girl and you reach a certain age, we'll say about middle school age, your body begins to change. Maybe sometimes you'll see girls who are in the 5th grade and they're already at full adult height, but they're not really mature as adults, and they may be getting the attentions of wolfish men. Well, if you take a 9-year-old who's starting to see these changes and you say, listen, you could be seduced or worse, or raped by a wolfish man. That's way too frightening for a 9-year-old to hear. That's very frightening, and almost impossible for them to truly understand what that means. But if you tell the story of a little girl who meets a talking wolf, then you can express the idea in a way that she can understand, a way that she can really see, a way that will hopefully affect her behavior and teach a moral lesson. Now, sometimes the moral lessons of literature are not quite that simple. Sometimes there are things like, why don't we look at this from a different character's perspective? Or why don't we see this social change from some other side? But in the end, literature really does offer hard wisdom from the past. When we have something that is hard to understand, either because it's difficult in itself or because it's difficult to talk about, we'll tell a story about it. We'll make characters, and you can experience things through those characters and understand the situation through how those characters understand them, and hopefully they'll teach you what you need to know for the future. One thing I don't like about the way that literature is often taught is very often when we give examinations about literature, what we'll do is we will give a quiz that asks you who are the major characters and what are the major plot points. Well, all that does is demonstrate that the person has read the literature. But in fact, to remember in Shakespeare's Hamlet that Hamlet's mother's name is Gertrude is one of the least important things to understand about the play. Instead, the play is about things like immaturity and your duties to the past, to your ancestors of the past, and the loyalties that you might have to your current family, or the way that a position in a family or in a kingdom can be usurped. I mean, there are many, many things that you could talk about Hamlet that are very important, deeply important. The name of this minor character or this plot point, actually Gertrude's not a minor character. The name of a major character is not one of the most important things. But we test and quiz on those things because they're easier things to test and quiz on. And we don't really tend to test and quiz on the harder things. And that's, I think, what essays and papers are about. They're really about trying to help the reader think more deeply about the thing and ask yourself, why is it that if you're reading a text that's 100 years old or 500 years old or 1,000 years old, why is it that for generations people have said, that was great, you need to read this too? Why is it that they keep getting passed along? If it's considered great literature, it's great literature because over time, again and again and again, people have said, this means something to me. This is important. And so what I would say is if you are in a literature class, the real answer to why are you here should be so I can learn how to glean hard wisdom from the past the easy way, by reading it through a story rather than by experiencing bad things in my own life. And so when I'm reading a book, when I'm reading a story, I'm asking myself, what are the hard things they're talking about? I'm not interested so much in remembering this minor character or this minor plot point. I'm much more interested in questions, the big questions, about the hard to talk about things, about religion, about politics, about money, about very difficult things. Those are hard things to talk about, but often very easy to read about. And that's the good way to learn things, through reading rather than through having a bad and hard life experience.